Hello, everybody, and welcome to Hash Rate. My name is Mark Jeffrey. My guest today is Keith Singery, Bittensor guru and validator. And we're here to get to the bottom of this Bittensor stuff I keep hearing about. So hello, Keith. How you doing, man?
Good. Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for coming on such short notice. I really, really appreciate that. So I've sort of been sticking my head into the Bittensor rabbit hole for the last few weeks for the first time. And, the basic idea is, these guys saw Bitcoin and they said, this is awesome. How do we do something like Bitcoin, but for AI? So instead of crunching a bunch of GPU looking for the hash of the previous block, instead, let's have a bunch of GPU crunching training data for LLMs and have a blockchain and this AI network that kind of work in concert together to produce sort of this open source Bitcoin-like AI. Do I have that part correct in your opinion?
I think if you zoom like really far out, you got it pretty close. As far as like the comparison to Bitcoin, I think the tokenomics are almost where it ends with Bittensor. I mean, the founders of Bittensor and many of the bigger players in the ecosystem are also, proponents of Bitcoin, of course, as most people are in the crypto space. But the incentive mechanism that drives Bittensor, this is really the differentiator between a chain like Bitcoin, which just, essentially solves a lottery with the most compute, of any network on the planet, right? 500 times bigger than any supercomputer or whatever it is. The way that Bittensor works is it borrows the tried and true tokenomics from Bitcoin, the 21 million halvings every 4 years. There's a couple burn mechanisms within Bittensor that we can get into that extend the halvings out. So you're not quite dealing with the 4 year, on the dot on the calendar with Bittensor. But the way that Bittensor works is it takes that compute and attempts to, the word that is used a lot in the community is distill intelligence from the miner. So the miner, like you say, in some cases is running an open source LLM, and the Bittensor network creates an incentive mechanism for that miner to contribute, unique or novel or valuable intelligence across the 32 subnets that make up Bittensor.
Okay, so just to recap a little bit. So the token for the Bittensor network is called TAO, TAO, and there are 21 million total, but only 6 million have been produced so far. Right. And at the time we're recording this, the price per coin is about $65 per coin. So it has like a $1.3 billion market cap. And we're going to get into this later, but so there's only 6 million coins floating around. 90% of those 6 million coins have been staked for validators. So there's actually a very small amount of coins kind of rolling around out there on the market. And we're seeing volumes of about, anywhere from 6 million to 10 million a day, which for, above $1 billion market cap, that's not very much, right? Usually you see like 100 million, 200 million in volume to move around something that's at like $1 billion in valuation. So that's what the tokenomics kind of look like right now. We'll get into the staking later. But what I want to get into, so a lot of people that when they hear this idea, including myself, I hear ChatGPT of Bitcoin and I think, okay, where's the command line where I can like go see this thing, right? And it was very difficult for me to figure out where that was. I eventually landed at Corcel, and that's one of the validators of the 32 total, which we'll get into that later. But there was only sort of one visible entry point that I could find. Is that the only one, or are there more?
There's a couple of different ways to sort of ping the miners that are running on the network. So, and just to clarify a couple things that you said there, almost everything was correct. We're trading it, though, 250 right now, not 65. But almost everything else that you said was pretty much correct.
Oh, I apologize. Totally apologies. Yes.
Yeah,
sorry.
no worries.
Totally wrong. $250. I was looking at a different coin earlier. Sorry.
We don't want to send people like, running the coin market cap. Like, what the fuck?
No. My bad.
So Corcel is actually running on top of a subnet that is run by someone in the community named Mog Machine, and he runs the second largest validator. So Corcel is independent, essentially, from the validation process, although it uses validators to support the front end that you would use. So like if we back up just a little bit, subnets, Bittensor subnets have only been around now for about 4 months, 4.5 months or so. And Corcel is one of those subnets. Prior to that, the Bittensor network was either made up for the first almost 2 years of either one or two subnets. And if it was two subnets, that was really in the 6 months prior to the 32 subnets being launched. And those two subnets were run by the Open Tensor Foundation, which is the same entity, the nonprofit entity that is responsible for the Bittensor codebase, the client that you use when you interact with the blockchain if you're not using one of the other, like the web wallet or one of the other wallets that are available. So the subnet that Bittensor or that OpenTensor originally created, there was a point, where you could go into the command line and ping the miners that were operating on this single subnet, which was emulating what you would see if you were using something like ChatGPT. So this was a text prompting subnet, and we can get into all the different types of subnets at some point. But the text prompting subnet was incentivizing miners to run open source large language models that would respond to a query coming from a validator, and the validator would say something like, explain to me how the Declaration of Independence was written. That miner would respond with a number of characters, text, and then that text would be put through a number of reward models, also smaller versions of large language models, basically, these reward models that the validators run on their own separate GPUs. And then those reward models in aggregate, I think there's 5 or 6 of them at this point on the text prompting network, would score the miners. And then that would incentivize what you're talking about, the miners to provide either a complex response, a unique response. Maybe there's some scoring for length. There's also scoring for, not duplicating the response of another miner to encourage diversity across the network or whatever. There's all of these elements that the Open Tensor Foundation designed within the reward models to kind of like suss out the intelligence from the miners. That's kind of what you're talking about when you're saying, pinging the network. Now, Corcel uses ChatGPT, so OpenAI, Anthropic. I believe now we're also providing a stability API on Corcel for some of the image stuff. So Corcel actually isn't pinging open source large language models that are running on the Bittensor network. Corcel is being mainly supported, at least from the text responses, by OpenAI.
Okay, so this is where it gets confusing, right? So when I first started digging into this, I did not realize that Corcel was basically just tapping OpenAI's API for the answers, right? So it's kind of like copying the other guy's paper, right? It feels like cheating, right? Even though within the Bittensor rules, it's not really. But when I first realized that, I'm like, wait a minute, this Bittensor stuff isn't that great. It's just using ChatGPT under the hood. It's a fraud, right? And really what Corcel is doing to a certain degree is banking the arbitrage between whatever it's costing them to use OpenAI's API and the amount of TAO Bittensor coin rewards that it's getting for supplying answers in the network, right? So it's running a small business and it's providing AI value to the network. So in that sense, it's kind of, it's doing what it's supposed to do. Now, is that cheating? I don't think Bittensor wants to be reliant on outside APIs forever. I don't think that's the goal here, but to a certain degree, it is right now. And I just want to go back to the idea of subnets, because I think a lot of people are like, wait, why are there subnets? What are those? So this is the way I understand it, the entire network of Bittensor at the moment is 32 subnets. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So there's 32 of these subnets, and each one of them are sort of a distinct AI model of some sort. So one of them is text responses like ChatGPT. Another one is images. I think there's some specialized LLMs for like medical and a few other things. I'm not sure if medical is one of them, but some of them have like narrow slivers, right? So narrow slivers of expertise. And in aggregate, there's 32 of them, and you may interact with one or more of them directly if they provide an interface, and they may interact with each other. So AI 31 might ask AI 3 for part of the answer, right? They sort of interact with each other. So did I get all that correct?
Yeah, on the subnet side, the because it's so basically early in the creation of these subnets, that there isn't really a lot of interaction between subnets at this point. Some builders of subnets are now building almost like augmentations to their existing networks to provide a value add service to whatever they can't fit in the logic of their existing subnet. So that is happening. It'll also happen organically as the network matures. But at this time, you're not really getting a lot of like cross-pollination between the subnets themselves. But you do have everything else pretty much correct, is that there's these different verticals that are being birthed through the subnet system in Bittensor, and then through the incentive mechanism, which is customized by each subnet owner. Because you're in Bittensor, you're not necessarily just creating a model and throwing it to your miners and saying, go run this model, and then all the miners run everything, the exact thing that you send them, and start sending you all the data, and you're just getting all the free, essentially horsepower for the GPUs that they're running or whatever. Bittensor, really, from a subnet perspective, is also about customizing and developing an incentive mechanism to drive the miners to give you what you're looking for. Like in the case of Corcel, for example, the miners are being scored by the validators who are also using ChatGPT APIs or OpenAI APIs to make sure that the miners are plugged into OpenAI. So if you're a miner and you get pinged by someone on Corcel, the idea is that you don't know if that question is coming from a validator like me, or if it's coming from someone just asking a random question at Corcel.io, right? So, and this is the reason that why Corcel exists, and why Bittensor is just a copycat network or whatever. This is just one of the 32 subnets. But the reason why Corcel originally was created is because Subnet 1, the subnet that birthed them all, this one had a difficulty because miners were filtering out questions from users who were using these chatbots that various people had developed. Like there was one on Twitter, there was one on Discord, and the miners, in order to conserve compute, came up with basically programs or algorithms to identify when the ping was coming from outside of the validation protocol, because they're really just concerned about earning TAO. Right.
Right. Well, let me stop you there for a second, because I think there's a point that was confusing for me. So the way this sort of architecture works at a high level, there are 32 subnets. Each subnet is run by a validator, and that validator beneath it. No, am I wrong?
Each subnet isn't run by a validator. Each subnet is made up of miners and validators. Those are essentially the two parties that operate within the subnet.
Okay, so there are multiple validators within a subnet.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, and but there definitely are miners, and the miners are supplying artificial intelligence. Whether they're getting it from somebody else and rebranding it as themselves, or they're producing it themselves, doesn't matter. That's just as long as they're supplying it. And then the validators, what they do is baked into the actual mining of TAO is something called Yuma Consensus, and this is where the validators validate that the miners are supplying legit AI. And we're going to I'm not quite sure how that process works, but they've got some sort of test suite that they put onto the AI to make sure, to basically gauge the responses and see which miners are doing the best. And the miners that are doing the best earn the most TAO, right? Or maybe they earn TAO totally and nobody else earns anything. I'm not sure how that works, but I
can explain Yuma Consensus real quick if you want, how that works.
Why don't we do that? Since we're here, let's just do that.
Yeah, it doesn't take long. So essentially what that is a mechanism to ensure fair play on the validation side, because as a validator, you could also be running miners. You could know a bunch of miners. I know a bunch of miners. If the miners that I know, want to score better, for example, they can run a validator themselves, or they can find someone like me and maybe pay me to come up with a program so that I use their UID, their unique identifier on the network, and score them higher than I'm scoring other miners, independent of whatever they produce for the network. And this can be done. But the reason why it doesn't happen is because you have a whole herd of validators all doing this process. And as long as you maintain a majority of honest validators, this is what contributes to your score as a validator. And a validator is earning essentially half the TAO on the network, right? There's 18% of the TAO each day goes to the subnet owners, and the remaining 82% is split 50-50 between the miners and validators operating on each of the 32 subnets. So within a single subnet, as a validator, when I'm providing scores for miners, my scores are then also basically compared using Yuma Consensus against the other validators that are doing the same thing within that subnet. If I start deviating from the normal or average score that's being given to a certain miner, and remember, we're all scoring it independently using our own queries. We're not asking the same questions, right? Then I start being penalized as a validator. And those penalties are enough, believe me, they're definitely enough to keep you honest. So
you get slashed, in other words, like in a normal reward system.
Yep.
So, yeah. So normally, like in the Bitcoin universe, validators, everything, when they're checking each other's work, it's deterministic, right? So you say you saw these transactions, this is the hash. I then go and replicate your work and be like, yep, that's it. Or no, that's totally not it, right? But it's very deterministic. Because each of the validators are asking different questions of the AI, the response, even if they ask the exact same question, the response can be totally different each time, even though materially it's more or less the same, right?
For
like
sure.
when you ask ChatGPT the same question twice, you'll get a different answer, right? It'll be basically the same, but different words, different points maybe. And so that is the basis on which your validation takes place. So the Yuma Consensus is sort of fuzzy. It allows you to compare these answers or mesh them together in a way to compare them, even though it's not deterministic. And that's really interesting, and that's really new, right? Like that's a very unique thing.
It's the most difficult thing about creating a network like Bittensor. I think that the founders and the guys over at OpenTensor would tell you this is once you get the tokenomics right, once you get the network set up, once you start developing things like the 32 subnets, then what you're relying on at this point is the ingenuity of the 32 subnet owners at this point to come up with ways to entice the miners to provide that intelligence that they're looking for. Because I'll give you an example. Maybe like 6 months ago or so, the network, 8 months ago, the network, when there was only a single subnet, the network was paused for like a couple weeks because basically the mining pool that was operating on this text prompting subnet had figured out how to game the system. So people were taking a single good model, like a 70 billion parameter model, or maybe output from an OpenAI response using ChatGPT, feeding that into like an AWS server, dressing it up and doing some post-processing so it looked like a different response, changing the beginning, changing the end, but using some very, very light compute to make it look like it was 200 different. And then they would feed the output of that, to their 200 different miners, but they only operated one GPU or however many they ran. So then they were using this post-processing to essentially game the reward mechanism so that if you went and asked a question to these miners, it would there'd be like weird shit in the response. You'd be like, this doesn't make any sense. So this is why one of the reasons why they, for a period of time, that subnetwork or that network text prompting was shut down and completely rebuilt. And I actually just installed it today on my validator and spun it up like right before the call. And what it does now is uses a combination from a couple of different sources to generate queries for miners that look they do look identical to things that you would see from users putting in to a normal interface like ChatGPT. So now miners have a very difficult sort of job of identifying where these queries are coming from validators and which ones can kind of be dressed up and scored differently and ones that are coming from outside of the ecosystem.
Right. So basically the validators, it was possible to fool them by they could tell the difference between a question that came in that was supposed to validate them, hello, I am mystery shopper XYZ, and I'm definitely not from the company, right? And which means he is from the company, right? The validator would have the mystery shopper come in, identify him as a mystery shopper, treat him better, and then when regular shoppers came in, just like whatever, treat them like dirt. And that was how they were gaming the system, because they were always getting A pluses when the mystery shopper came in, even though really they should have been getting F minuses from the regular customers, right? So this new release that just released, I guess it was today, that fixes it so that you cannot tell the difference between a mystery shopper and a regular shopper in terms of validation when they come to your store. Now
that's a great way to describe it. The mystery shopper problem. Every subnet within Bittensor has the mystery shopper problem, and this is just one of the solutions that Subnet 1 implemented. The other thing they've implemented is actually using a secondary scoring system to take the responses from two different miners and pit them against each other. So rather than using an independent scoring, so that as a miner I'm only scored on a validation mechanism that's sitting within a single validator, now they'll have a validator score one person's or one miner's response against another, so that this creates an additional check on the back end, so that if you start putting some weird crap in there that makes that makes the scoring mechanisms in the validator like your response, but someone else doesn't, your response becomes a little bit less intelligent when you do that. Because if it was already perfect when it first came out, you had to change something. You had to make it worse in some way. Right. And so when you compare it to a different response from a completely different miner, then you can sort of normalize those two things and not just have a manipulation to the scoring mechanism within the validator itself. That's another element of it.
So when you test the whole idea of testing these AIs for good AI, like a human could do it pretty well, I think, right? Anyone who's spent some time with ChatGPT and has sort of a developer's background, you start thinking how can I fool this thing, and you get good at kind of getting the vibe of what works and what's good and what's not, and what makes it hallucinate, what probably won't it hallucinate on. That would seem to me to be a very human-centric evaluation path. In other words, I don't know how a machine does it. Don't humans have to be coming up with these tests, I guess is my question. And doesn't that take away from the automation of a system like this? How can machines come up with tests that are good enough for this? I assume they are. I assume it's machine generated, right?
Yeah, I mean, the way that this also depends on the subnet, right? So the way that they do it, for example, we'll stick with the text prompting subnet because we're kind of down that track, but I can give another example too. The way that they do it on the text prompting subnet is they use a model that generates conversational input. They use also input from Wikipedia, and I can't remember the other source, but there's several sources that they use, and they combine these sources to essentially emulate a real person's questions. So as a miner, you'd be doing more work to figure out if that question was real or fake than you would to just answer the question at this point, Okay,
so it's basically, yeah, go ahead.
And then I'll give you another example on the subnet 8, which does a time series prediction subnet. And right now it does the price of Bitcoin. That's just focusing on that. Eventually it'll move into other financial instruments. But that one's easy because all it does is give you a timestamp in the future, asks you to give me the price of Bitcoin at that time. If you're, like you said, if you're a human and you could type it in fast enough, you could be a miner. I mean, it's very difficult to do that with the amount of pings that you get, but it's certainly possible. And on the subnet number 8, you can't fake anything because all you're doing is providing the price of Bitcoin at some point in the future. So there is no gamification mechanism. And there's many subnets that operate like that as well, where it's much clearer as to what you're providing versus subnet 1, which is essentially the text prompting subnet is trying to solve one of the more difficult problems.
Okay, so to repeat what you said in sort of different words. So normally LLMs will harvest sentience exhaust from the internet on Wikipedia and elsewhere to produce answers. And instead you have an LLM that does the opposite. It harvests sentience exhaust to produce questions that are very much like what a human would do. And it's gotten very good at this. and knows what the what a good response should be to this. How does it know what a good response should be? Does it go and ask ChatGPT and then compare your response to that? Like how does that happen?
So
Where do you get the answer key from?
That's what that's what Subnet 18 does. It does what you described there. The validator does go ask ChatGPT.
Got it.
Subnet 1 is tackling a much more difficult problem where it's asking, it's basically creating these buckets of reward that are available within the validation mechanism that, for example, I run on that subnet. On my GPU, then, is these individual models that the Open Tensor Foundation have tuned, just like fine tuning like a piano or something, like you're trying to suss out the intelligence because you actually don't know what models these guys are even running on the back end. So you're trying to create a network then where you've got intelligence coming out, and you could measure it by, like I said, you can measure it by complexity, you could measure it by uniqueness, you could measure it against one another, and you could measure it by reading level. There's an untold number of different metrics that you can use as a subnet owner to then try and incentivize your miners to provide the type of intelligence that you're looking for.
Okay.
And this is the sauce. This is like the magic sauce of Bittensor, and what differentiates it from every other protocol is that there's no project that I'm aware of on the planet where you've then opened up the field to people to not only use artificial intelligence to generate value within these subnets, but then you've also tasked them with the never-ending, essentially, effort that goes into manicuring their own ecosystem of miners and validators by developing these incentive mechanisms that each one on their own is like a very complex version of just of solidifying the value that's coming out of their subnet. And if they fail at that, then the subnet goes away because it's not providing, as a miner, the way that Bittensor works as well. I mean, the way that it'll work in a couple months when something called dynamic TAO comes out is one thing. But the way that it works now is that as a miner or validator, you basically know like how good the subnet is because you can look at the output. Like we've got a couple subnets, for example, that go out to Reddit and Twitter, and they scrape data and they bring it back. So people that are good enough to look at these databases that are being created can identify, for example, when there's duplicates in there, or when the data that's being scraped is old, for example, which would suggest that a miner isn't actually going out and scraping new tweets. He might be pulling it from some other database. So there's all of these different sort of then checks that you do on the validation side that allow you to understand if what the subnet is doing is what they say they're doing. And then that's where, and we should probably get into this too, that's where the emissions come in, because as a validator, with your percentage of the network, you're also responsible for allocating that percentage to each individual subnet. So like the validator that I run has roughly like 7% of the TAO that's staked, 7% of the 90% that you mentioned, right? And the other 10% is either floating out there as liquidity or not delegated or whatever. But the 90% that is staked is all sitting on individual validators, and every one of those validators has the opportunity to distribute that percentage however they see fit across the subnet, across the 32 subnets.
Not the staked TAO, but the emitted TAO, right? Like you're not handing out your own TAO. It's coming out of the system with each block, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you get a say. You basically can direct 7% of those block emissions in any way that you see fit, depending on your validation scores. Yes.
Yeah, it is not dependent on my validation scores, though. I don't even have to be validating for me to put. I could put emissions on a subnet, and I don't have to be validating there.
So, what decides where the emissions? Who gets the emissions? Like, how do you decide which miners get them?
This is where it gets very complicated, because this is kind of why Bittensor is now moving towards a market-based mechanism rather than someone like myself manually assigning value on each of these 32 subnets, because there's a hell of a lot of things you have to consider. The first thing you're considering is like, what does the subnet do? Is it doing something that has value outside of the Bittensor ecosystem? Is it doing something that's 3 other subnets are already doing? what's the team like? Does the team have an AI ML background? What's the code base like? Is it clean? How about the instructions for the miners and the validators? Is their GitHub like intelligible, or does it have a bunch of crap they copy and pasted from the template in there? You can look at the ecosystem of miners, like something like TAO stats, which taostats.io allows you to see the makeup of each individual subnet. So you can see how many miners are being run from a single IP or a single wallet address. So if I look at a network on a subnet, for example, and I see 50% of the miners are from a single entity, well, that network's been taken over. Like I don't need to support that network, these type of things.
Okay, so just to summarize, you're all hand cranking this on a certain level. Yeah, and you're making the humans are making human judgments about what they're seeing. I think that's okay, because I think the intent is to get rid of the humans later. But for right now, there is a certain level of hand cranking. Yeah. And I assume that to run a subnet, you have to apply and get approved. There's some approval process, and that's hand cranked as well.
No, that's the awesome thing. Well, that's the very difficult thing about Bittensor, but also one of the best things about it. It's totally open. Mining, validating, registering a subnet. You don't have to ask anybody if you have enough TAO to do it, or your scores are good enough as a miner to stay registered. Anybody can come in. You don't have to dox yourself. There's random people all over the planet that are doing it, and nobody knows who they are.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So basically, if I have enough TAO to stake in my mining or validating operation, I'm part of the network. And I don't have to ask permission, and nobody can kick me out so long as I have enough TAO.
Right. And as a miner, you don't even need to stake TAO. You can come in with 0 TAO. And if you have AI or ML background, you can, or not. I mean, I've seen some guys in the last couple months get a couple of dozen miners up and running on different subnets that had absolutely 0 AI experience, but they're a fast study, and they're also motivated with the token price being what it is to be, learning this stuff on the fly. And so there's opportunity available within Bittensor for people that can't go buy it OTC or can't go buy it on one of these exchanges or whatever. And then on the validating side, to actually be validating, one of the barriers to that right now is if you don't have around 20,000 TAO, it's very difficult to become a validator, because the miners don't have to respond to you, and they actually, you don't hold enough to merit a response, essentially. And if you don't have a response from a miner, you show a 0 score on your validator. When you get compared to a larger validator who gets responses from all the miners, it looks like you're not doing your job. So if you don't have 20,000 TAO, which roughly right now is whatever, I don't know, what is it, 1.5 million or something like that. Anyway, if you don't have something like, any kind of like a decent dollar amount, you're not going to have a position in the network. Yeah. And then subnets, anyone could register a subnet. You don't even lose your TAO when you register. It just gets locked up. And if your subnet gets deregistered because it doesn't have enough emissions, and another subnet comes in behind you and takes one of the 32 slots, you get your TAO back. So it's just it's just a lockup for subnet registration.
Okay, but I didn't realize that. So there's only 32 slots available. So, and if you suck, you can get kicked out of one of those slots.
The whole Bittensor network is churning. Like the mining side is just a forever churn where the bottom 5% are getting kicked out. People are trying to come in and get those top slots. I had a subnet actually that I lost my own subnet slot like a month ago. I hadn't even launched yet, so I expected I would lose it. But because there's 32 slots, I think there's 26 or 27 subnets that are actually up and running with active code bases on GitHub where you can spin up a miner or a validator. So there's still a couple slots that are open for people that have ideas or whatever that don't have a lot of emissions at this point.
Okay, so this thing's like Highlander. Like, basically, well, there can be only 32. It's not one, but it is basically Highlander. You can like anybody at any time can be taken down if somebody more powerful comes into the mix. Okay.
And it will expand to 64.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. So
it will expand to 128. It'll probably go to 256 at some point. We were at 5 months ago, we were at 2. 4 months ago, we were at 8. And we were at 8 for about, 6 weeks. And that filled up immediately. And then we've been at 32 now for about, 3-4 months. And we'll go to 64 or 48 or something soon, because you can see that the The other thing that I can see as a validator now that we've had this model up and running for a few months, is the AI and ML talent within Bittensor is increasing to the point where like I'm starting to lose track of the conversations that I'm trying to keep track of to put emissions into the network in the right way. This is why we have to move to a market mechanism for distributing these emissions, because for someone like myself, I'm keeping these 26, 27 servers up and running. And for me to do that and also like move with agility on the scoring mechanism and keep up to date with everything that's going on across the subnets, like it's impossible. I'll never do as good as the market mechanism would.
Okay, so let me ask you another question. So you are supplying AI to the network, and but there are actually consumers. There are people and machines, but probably right now people who are consuming that AI product. Do those consumers of the AI product have to pay you in TAO for each query? Is there's some mechanism there for that, or is that just is it all free?
Eventually, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you have costs associated with running all these machines, right? You got GPU costs. You've got a data center somewhere with machines. You're paying money to keep all this stuff up and running. So if people are not paying you, I know you're getting the TAO rewards, which means you must be selling TAO in the open market. Somehow you have to be paying for those machines, right? So I'm trying to figure out like how the economics of that work, and if people don't have to pay TAO right now to use the AI services, why the hell would I pay why would I pay ChatGPT for the upgrade for like the $20 a month or whatever it is when I could just use this for free? There's a lot of questions in there, so I'll let you.
That's why a lot of people have canceled their ChatGPT membership that when they discover Corcel, because Corcel is essentially funded by the difference or by the profit that you're making running a miner or running a validator on the network and earning the TAO, and then
TAO arbitrage effectively.
For Corcel, that's the way it works exactly. And with the other subnets, we're not to the point where we've created really anything that's valuable outside of the ecosystem, other than some of the image subnets that are up and running at this point. So, you can generate images just like you would with Midjourney or whatever. But those are also free. And the reason it's free, like from a validator side, now I run the validator I run has 7% of the network. It's like 380,000 TAO or something. But I can tell you that my equipment costs are less than 0.5% of what I earn in a month, and I don't mean me, I just mean my validator. The way that I run mine, I take everybody's 18% that I earn as a validator for basically allowing people to come in and delegate their TAO. And I subtract out of that whatever the equipment costs are for the month. We split it totally equally based on stake. And then I just send that 18%, or it ends up being about 17.5% after I take that 0.5% out. I just distribute that to the 400 or 500 wallets that have put their TAO on my validator. There's a couple other validators that do this type of kickback mechanism. There's quite a few larger ones that don't do this kickback mechanism. But that's essentially how it works and why it's free at this point to use Bittensor, because the difference between the token price that and what you're earning is so large that we don't have to do that. But at some point, and these tools are being built now by at least 2 different parties that I know of within the ecosystem, you're going to be paying with Stripe. You're going to be paying with whatever, ETH, Bitcoin, USDC, whatever wallet integration. I mean, there's going to be wallet integrations to everything probably. You'll be able to pay with other cryptocurrencies or with your US dollar to access the intelligence that's being generated on the Bittensor network.
Okay, so what is, first of all, what is the name of your subnet, or what's the
my validator? It's Bittensor Guru is the name of my validator. Yeah.
Okay, and is that subnetwork? I think you keep saying subnet 8. Is that you? Or do you have a number?
So the validator is totally separate from the subnet. The validator that I run, and that maybe the top 10 validators, all run on every subnet. So I run 26 or 27 different servers across the ecosystem. And when you stake your TAO with a validator like me or any of the other validators, you earn emissions as a staker, or it's called a delegate or a nominator. but you essentially delegate your TAO to the validator, and then you earn 82% of whatever that validator earns each day. The validator keeps, in most cases, 18% of what you've allowed them to earn. And that's the mechanism that they use to pay for equipment costs. And that's the price that you have to pay in order to earn free TAO as someone who's staking with a validator.
Right. Okay. So, but there's no instance where TAO is sort of consumed as gas, or a consumer pays TAO in order to access AI at this time, and nor is there a plan to do that in the future, I guess, right?
So, no, there is a plan to do that in the future for sure.
Oh, there is. Okay.
Yeah, this is essentially the long game with Bittensor. I mean, we're still in this incubation phase, right? With
no, there's no judgment on. Just to be very clear, no judgment at all on any of this. I'm just trying to understand what's up and running, what's not. Because I think when I think it through, right now the tokenomics of TAO remind me of the tokenomics of Ohm. Remember 3.3 back in the day, right? Where basically everybody was very incentivized to stake because you'd make so much more of the native token, right? You'd make a lot more Ohm if you staked your Ohm, right?
Sure.
So 80-90% of the people staked their Ohm. But there was nothing else driving that tokenomic except that, and at a certain point that fell apart, right? So that can go on for some period of time. It could even go on for like a year and a half or something, and do very well to bootstrap into something else. But it's long term not sustainable. So that was my fear when I sort of looked at this. I was like, this feels a little bit familiar in not a good way, right? So you're just staking TAO to earn TAO, and I as long as there's a plan to move away from that at some point, I think it's okay.
The plan, yeah. I'm sorry if I seem defensive. I just get fired up about TAO because it's all I do every day. So, like, if I seem emotional or something, don't worry. I'm not actually mad about it or anything. But yeah, the plan is baked in to the protocol, because the way that it works is that to access the intelligence that exists coming out of the miners, you have to come into the network through the validator. So, like in Corcel, for example, the only way you can ping one of those miners, and the only way a miner is going to respond to you, is if you're a validator. Because a miner doesn't care if you're pinging them from outside the network. You're not feeding them any TAO. The miners are in a symbiotic relationship with the validator, and if you break that relationship, you can't get to the miner anymore. So that's why all of the validators continue to hold their TAO, because and that's why as a delegator, you're also incentivized to put your TAO on this validator, and why you don't take it off, because you would also at some point, through things that the validators are building and the subnets are building, have access to the intelligence that's coming out of the mining pools. See what I'm saying?
So the validators are like sort of, in a sense, I mean, I guess they're not paying for it, but they have to stake for it. Right, because the miners are actually the source of the AI. So if the validators, and they'll only talk to validators, so the validators have to have a giant amount of TAO staked in order for the miners to talk to them. So it's not quite paying, but there's at least sort of a gateway there. So that's better.
Right.
That's north of nothing. So that's good, I think.
And the idea is, as a miner, eventually, I mean, most of the larger validators at this point were miners. That you graduate from mining and you go into validating in order to, basically keep your TAO working for you.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about the chain for a second, because I've got a few questions there. So you guys are part of the DePIN revolution, right? That's becoming that's all the rage right now, at least according to the reports I read over Christmas and early part of January. And most of those projects are on Solana, or they've been on something else, and now they moved to Solana, right? So Render is one of them. Filecoin is another one. I think I'm not sure if Filecoin's moved or not, but the number of the big DePIN projects have moved to Solana. You guys chose to do your own blockchain, and I assume that was because of the Yuma Consensus primarily. What is it? Is it a fork of Bitcoin that's been modified? Like, what is the genesis of your blockchain, and why did you choose it?
I think the reasons why the founders of Bittensor, and this is probably better answered by them. I think I can remember kind of what they've said in the past. I didn't create the project, so I can't really necessarily tell you, but I know for sure that one of the reasons why they decided to go this route of having their own chain was to have the agility to be able to make decisions that you could never do if you were linked to a larger blockchain. So if you're operating under ETH or Solana or whatever, the type of things that we've done recently, like with the subnets, for example. I mean, this is stuff that, you didn't have to ask anybody. And since the project is changing so much in these early years, we would have gotten totally bogged down in whatever governance process exists in those other chains that we don't even have to be a part of at this point.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could. I mean, could you have baked in some of those things into a smart contract? I guess it's debatable, but
smart contracts are also at some point going to be launched on Bittensor. It's on the roadmap for probably 2020, early 2025. So I think they'll eventually get there, but at this point we don't have them.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. So one of the other things I read about Bittensor is there are a number of apps that are possible on it. The obvious AI apps like the ChatGPT-ish things, the Midjourney-ish things, the medical AI thing, but also doing generalized compute in the style of render or generalized file storage in the style of Filecoin. How does that work? Like, how does that fit into this milieu? I'm not quite sure how that would work.
There's a couple subnets that are doing decentralized file storage, and how they actually incentivize the miners on those subnets to provide that storage. They have an incentive mechanism that is successful at identifying how much available space that those miners have, and then essentially testing that space is truly there. And there, like I said, there's a couple subnets doing that. There's one subnet 27, that's doing decentralized compute, and they have the same thing there, where you say you're running an H100, and they have a incentive mechanism or a testing process that can identify if you're actually running an H100 or not. And then the idea is that those basically either space in the case of the storage subnets or GPUs in the case of the compute subnet are available for use through the validator.
Okay. So really Bittensor, it's not even necessarily just about AI. It is, because these things are not like render and Filecoin are not necessarily AI, right? They're DePIN. They're definitely DePIN. But this feels to me like Bittensor really, it sort of supersets AI with these other things. It's really just sort of this decentralized staking and payment rails infrastructure for sort of an open marketplace, right? So it's more that, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, and when this clicks, then usually people join the ecosystem, because then that is the sauce that like keeps you coming back. Yeah, exactly. It keeps you coming back for more, because show me another chain that has this incentive mechanism baked into the building process. I don't know of anyone that does. And then the thing is, the incentive mechanism was specifically designed around pulling this information out of artificial intelligence models. So Bittensor existed, a year and a half or something before, ChatGPT started becoming popular. And this whole idea behind using the incentive mechanism to I always think about it like almost like getting the gopher to come out of the hole or something. You have to throw some bait down there and figure out how to get that intelligence out of your miners. And the things that people are doing now, I'll give you an example. I was on a call just a couple of days ago with a subnet called Image Alchemy. I think it's subnet 26. They have now baked into the incentive mechanism RLHF type scoring. So this is reinforced learning by human feedback. This is like what, if anyone listening is familiar with Scale.ai, Scale does institutional or enterprise, basically increasing the value of a data set by either labeling or, if you have a bunch of responses, they might say oh, that's a stop sign. Oh, that's a horse, right? If it's video. And if it's if it's text, they might say this response is too mean. Oh, this response is too I don't know, racist, or whatever the different, things they're going to use to classify those responses. This is now being baked into the incentive mechanism for this particular subnet so that we can use those to further incentivize and score the miners. So now you mentioned earlier, like, oh, anyone can become a miner. If you can type fast enough, you can be a miner yourself. Now, as a validator, you are going to have either you, like me, I'm not going to spend all day doing it, but maybe I would pay someone to do it. I don't know. Go onto this app that exists for this subnet and start grading individually as a human. And, there would have to be some of these like CAPTCHA mechanisms to make sure it's not an AI doing the actual grading, right? But this like novelty that's coming out of this process of trying to make the miners hold their feet to the fire, make them do their work honestly, is creating some really unique things around Bittensor that I don't see anywhere else. There's also like these feedback loops that are happening, like on Subnet 8, for example. This is like one of the perfect, if you want to take like a master class in how to build a subnet on Bittensor, I suggest learning about Subnet 8 because this is the subnet that does time series prediction. And instead of the typical model of where you have no idea what models that the miners are running, in this case, the guys that are building it, it's a company called TAO, and they're like traditional finance guys. And they found some post on somebody's Twitter on Bittensor and like lost their minds and created this company now around Bittensor. And what they're doing is they've hired a bunch of AI ML talent to build the miner that their own mining pool is using. So they'll basically like use the input from their mining pool to further improve the tool that the miners are using on their own subnet by hiring their own ML people. So their ability to predict the price of Bitcoin or any financial asset not only is being improved by the miners themselves, but every time they introduce another data set, or when you're predicting the price of Bitcoin, you can pull all kinds of information from anywhere, from different financial metrics to the blockchain itself to wallet movements, anything. When they introduce all of these things, then the mining pool itself gets a new version of their miner for free. That miner then, in the case of Subnet 8, like over the course of the last couple months, is like king of the hill for a while. So then it beats most of the existing miners on the subnet. Then all the miners start figuring out how to fine tune that model to predict the price of Bitcoin even better. And then that information, when it goes back into the validators and back to the guys that created the model themselves, now it's their job to beat the mining pool, feed them a new model, and the whole thing just continues to spin inside of itself. This is where I think you'll see the difference between Bittensor and other AI applications. Is you'll see these like almost like Web 2 processes happening, like whether it's scraping on Twitter or Reddit, or whether it's this time series prediction subnet that's using the price of Bitcoin, or whether it's like the the text prompting subnet that's taking the text that's coming from the miners and using it to retrain their own incentive mechanisms. But you'll have these like data generating activities or intelligence generating activities from the mining operation that you'll then use to improve your subnet operations themselves. That's something that I see happening on Bittensor that like gets me extremely excited because I don't see it happening other places.
So put another way, in the Bittensor network, product market fit evolution happens at an accelerated rate. So you're continually like basically the product and the market are interacting a lot faster than it is anywhere else. And so you basically get this accelerated evolution of products.
Yeah, except right now, because of how early it is still, your market fit is your fit within the validating and mining and the communities, essentially. You're looking for support from the Bittensor community because outside of Corcel, there really isn't a lot of buy-in right now from anyone using the random front ends that have been created. But yeah, you're right. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that is pretty interesting. So we're coming up on the hour here, and I don't like to go over, but one last couple questions around legal. So there's a lot of new regulation being contemplated around AI. How do you guys think about that, or do you just not think about it? And what do you see coming down the road that could stop you in your tracks, or is this just unstoppable?
Because it borrows the elements of Bitcoin, of like I said before, of being completely open and decentralized, and you don't know who the miners are. You know, if you had to be a validator and you didn't want anyone to know who you were, you could do that anonymously as well. I don't think you could kill this project. It's kind of like the Bitcoin Hydra thing. You know, you kill one mining pool, another one just pops up the next day. Obviously, like if you're doxxed and you're operating in an environment where you've got certain legal issues, maybe you could have an issue. I mean, you could have a problem for sure. I know that the legislation that's been passed around like, oh, you can't run more than this many H100s. The whole thing's distributed. So you couldn't ever like pin anyone down for running too much compute on the network because there isn't anyone to pin down. You know, there's just a bunch of random UIDs and IPs. Some of them are running their own compute. Some of them are running their compute through, you know, like a VPN or something. So you don't even know if they're running on one of these RunPod or Paperspace or Vulture or whatever, these different places where you can rent compute, right? The other thing about Bittensor that the OpenTensor team did a fantastic job at from the very beginning is adhering to these, what's it called, the Howey test, right? For making sure that your coin is considered a commodity. So like I've been a moderator on the official Discord for, I don't know, almost a year now. There's no price talk allowed. The team itself doesn't do any token listings. All marketing and token listings are done by the community. And there's other elements of it as well. But the team has had a very, very like intentionality put upon how they operate to make sure that we stay on the right side of the law, at least on the tokenomics are concerned. On the AI stuff, it's hard to know what's going to happen with that. But I rather have my I rather have my chips in the decentralized, open, anonymous AI, free for the people AI than, ChatGPT and OpenAI and the others,
Yeah, no, that's so this is super fascinating. I'm down the rabbit hole, and I'm definitely going to go deeper because the more I dig here, the more interesting it looks. And it does remind me of some very early things when I first encountered them for the first time, where it's like you don't know everything, and some of it looks sketchy even, and some of it looks genius. And it's sort of both at once, right?
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
When I tell the story, you probably don't know this, but I found Vitalik about 3 weeks before the Ethereum ICO.
Oh,
right?
cool.
And that looked super sketch. It was like, some guy in Russia, give me your Bitcoin, and in a year maybe I'll send you some of my coin. Right? It wasn't really clear whether that was actually going to happen or not. And I think you guys are further along than that. It's not quite as rough, but sometimes these things don't always look pretty at first, right? All that what is that Jared Tolkien? All that glitters is not gold, and
sure.
Sometimes the scruffy guy in the corner is Strider, who happens to be the king, right? You just don't know yet because he looks like a scruffy guy in the corner, right?
Yeah.
So, but there's also, you can see that there's a gem there, and I kind of get that feeling with this. It feels very much the same, right? It feels like a Strider. So, cool. I hope it is.
I'm glad you think so.
Yeah, I'm going to keep digging around on it, but so far so good. So, Keith, where can people find you online? What do you want to plug?
Bittensor Guru. You can do a Google search for that. I'll pop right up. Or Keith Singery on Twitter. You can find me on the Discord too, the official Discord for Bittensor. I'm always in there bouncing around.
Well, thank you once again, Keith, especially for coming on for such short notice and giving us such great explanations and for putting up with my dumb questions. Very much.
Oh, no, man, they were good. Thank you.
So, my name is Mark Jeffrey. This has been Hash Rate. We'll see you all next time.